intellectual property book, and was one of the core scenario team leaders in the other scenarios publication. And then there is Chidi Wamana next to Nagla. Chidi is also a contributor to both books. And then next to Chidi is Dick Kavuya, one of the core scenario leaders as well, and a contributor to a chapter in the other book. And then my colleague Douglas Gishuki is on the other edge of the table. Douglas also served as an open air fellow, and our times overlapped in Cape Town. So Jeremy is going to begin by giving you a very brief introduction of the open air project, and then we are going to showcase a video about the output of our research for this project. Followed by that is going to be a short interactive Q&A session in which we would like to hear your feedback and reflection about this publication, and then we will move on to showcasing our end publication. So, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you very much, Megan. I'll be brief. I really just want to introduce three things about the Open African Innovation Research and Training Project. I'd like to speak very briefly about our three core activities, which we've started to engage in nearly a decade ago and continue to engage in now and are continuing into the future. Those three things are building social capital, generating substantive research insights, and translating those research insights into concrete policy impact. On the first of those, social capital, we have created an epistemic community, a network of experts working in the field of intellectual property, access to knowledge, and innovation that spans across the continent of Africa, with linkages from that fellowship program to several candidates who didn't already have PhDs, enroll in PhD programs on the African continent, which is very unique and one of the interesting ways in which we're working to build local capacity. We also have nearly 4 dozen affiliated researchers in those 14 countries that I mentioned, and this contributes to the social capital that's necessary to create policy change. Those researchers are involved in active empirical research to generate substantive insights. One of the things that my colleague and friend Dick Kavuya pioneered in 2006 was a real methodological innovation where we would study legal and economic issues, not by thinking about large-scale policies on an international or regional or national level that are far removed from the day-to-day realities facing people in the countries where we're working, but rather connect those overarching frameworks to the realities on the ground. So using innovative social scientific research methods, we were able to break new ground in the area of intellectual property law and policy and economics, and really generate some substantive insights. The new research that we're about to present to you today deals with an issue of collaborative dynamics of intellectual property. We realize through this research that knowledge production and innovation systems are inherently collaborative activities, and particularly so throughout the regions of the African continent. And yet there's a disconnect between orthodox legal and economic and political assumptions about intellectual property, that it's an individualistic activity. It's very much not. That's what our case study showed. I'll show you videos of that in a few minutes. And finally, practical policy impact, and that's really the point of this session. We've had meetings in countries throughout Africa and regions around the world trying to translate our research into concrete policy changes. So rather than speaking any further, I invite you to have a look at some of the videos that capture our research findings, and to browse through the books that are available on the desk at the side of the room while you're watching these videos, and then provide your feedback, because that's the most meaningful part of engagement with an audience like this, is actually to listen to your reactions and to move forward together in a dialogue from there. Thank you.
After 3 years of research, the Open African Innovation Research and Training Project, known as OpenA, is making its findings public. Participants from more than 50 countries are attending a conference hosted by the University of Cape Town, where OpenA's new book is being launched.
Innovation happens in Africa in very complicated and complex processes that are really not ones that you can definitely recognize through these formalized metrics of measuring who is innovating and who is not innovating.
The book provides results from 13 case studies that look at communal, collaborative innovation and intellectual property across 9 African countries.
I'm Sandy Shepherd, publisher for UCT Press, and the very proud publisher of this very important book, Innovation and Intellectual Property, Collaborative Dynamics in Africa.
Intellectual property in the conventional sense has always been captioned or conceptualized in the context of a capitalist, one-person kind of breakthrough innovation that is either owned by an individual or a corporation. And little attention is paid to the knowledge production methods that are very communal and collaborative in nature.
By using IP creatively, you can facilitate a kind of community. The communities operate on different levels. We need to broaden our perspectives outside of this siloed approach towards intellectual property to better create systems that are useful in practice.
I think that the tendency to conceptualize these concepts is to do it on parallel tracks. So one group of people will speak innovation, another will speak IP, another will speak about collaboration. And so what I love about this book is that it brings all of those threads or those lines of reasoning together in one text.
The book, freely available on the OpenAIR website and in hard copy from its publisher, covers 6 thematic areas. The first theme focuses on practices in Africa's informal sector.
My chapter in this book is chapter 3. My chapter focuses on formal and informal sector interactions with a specific focus on the new electric vehicle project at Makerere University. What is actually happening is that they designed the car, but a lot of parts were actually fabricated by the informal artisans. It is an important innovation to be able to interpret those designs and translate them into a product. The artisans are expected not to share this information or designs with other people. So that is the extent to which IP is involved. The key recommendation I make in my chapter is for government policy to not focus only on university industry relationships. They also need to look at the possibility of transferring technology to the informal artisan.
The chapter that Dr. Dani and I worked on is geographical indications in relation to cocoa production and coffee in Ghana and Ethiopia respectively.
A geographical indication is a type of intellectual property whereby the name of the place where a product originates is used in the product's marketing and can only be used by producers meeting certain locally specific requirements.
Our research can as well relate to Kenyan tea or Ugandan vanilla or South African rooibos.
Also, looking at the potential of place-based intellectual property is the book's Nigerian case study.
We selected 2 clusters in Nigeria, one on textiles and the other on leather. Traditional textiles is an indigenous knowledge that is slowly dying. There is a high-end market for those products, but at the same time, they have to face challenges from imitation products from China and also products that are made using machine processes. The research question was how feasible it is to use communal trademarks to overcome those challenges.
This is one aspect of intellectual property that is very collaborative, that is open and yet closed in the sense that people who are not producing within the cultural region or process as an Ethiopian coffee are excluded from this. But those who produce based on the traditional arable lands can really benefit from this branding method.
I was trying to focus on the policy context. Is it possible to have a traditional knowledge commons in Kenya? And if it is, what is the policy environment that would facilitate the sustainability of this particular commons?
If you have a TK Commons, basically it's a system whereby knowledge is shared among the people in a way that first and foremost preserves the knowledge, and at the same time it allows other people to use that particular knowledge beyond the communities for purposes of development.
Also examining the notion of a traditional knowledge commons is the book's chapter on an existing commons, established by the Kukula traditional healers in South Africa. A Kukula leader, Rodney Sibui, is in Cape Town for the book's launch.
The type of knowledge that we are having is the indigenous knowledge. It's knowledge about treatment of ailment of diseases. And there we are using the species, the plants.
Now this TK Commons has more the idea of sharing knowledge within all kinds of different healers. It doesn't matter which kind of healing schools they're from or where they come from, which ethnic group, to then be able to negotiate with outside interests.
When we started, we were about 80 healers that come together, so that if there is some potential investors or the company that like to develop business with us, and then they can come to us, then we can share the legacy with them.
The creators of knowledge do know what they want, they know what they need, and even they know what the consumers want.
How does our law accommodate the sharing aspect with the aspect of propertization or commodification of what we have created?
I chose to work on a case study that looks at the independent musicians in Egypt, to look at the priorities of the musicians themselves, but also the music users or consumers, and try to better inform policymakers regarding the copyright laws. What I have found is that digital music is usually seen by both groups as something that should be there for free. Now, the essence in working out a business model for music and creative industries, as with other knowledge goods, is trying to find a combination of versions. So in the case of music, we have the live scene, we have the CD, and we have online. We think of hybrid models or freemium, where there is some kind of payment that will be paid for one version and the rest can be available for free.
My chapter is entitled Reflections on Open Scholarship, Modalities and Copyright Environment in Kenya. And the focus here was the relationship between copyright on the one hand and open scholarship as well as alternative publishing in Kenya on the other hand. I found in the research that the relationship between copyright and scholarship, whether traditional or open, is quite nuanced and complex. This indicates to us that the work that is being done on the Creative Commons is very, very important.
The chapter, co-authored by Caroline Murray and Lucy Abrahams, looks at how university research management in South Africa is adjusting to a new piece of intellectual property legislation.
So what the Act does really is to prompt researchers and the institutions to first of all patent or protect by other means of intellectual property law, and then to commercialize the research. And the end game, I suppose, is to make money. Commercialize, make money, and then give us a return.
It calls itself an IP Act. It's not an IP Act. Let's just be absolutely clear about that. It is a patent act. And the problem is that it actually misses loads of issues. It misses issues about how to disseminate knowledge in what is clearly a transition to a knowledge-intensive economy.
The danger of prompting or encouraging widespread to become mindless faculty is that you will have a diversion of resources towards what is not really important. Now, because there's legislation, there is a tendency to disclose any and everything. And so the tech transfer office staff now spend a lot of time trawling through reams of paper.
Another chapter on publicly funded outputs is by Vonvosan Belete, who looks at Ethiopian government's push via a 2012 policy for patenting of university research. Belete finds that the policy is misdirected.
In the Ethiopian context, the major problem is the weak research capacity of the universities, not research outputs which are piling up in university laboratories because of some sort of lack of incentive to be transferred to industry.
Also, looking at publicly funded research outputs is the chapter by statistician Njoku Ola Ama, whose survey of researchers in Botswana finds low levels of IP policy awareness. The book has 3 chapters on patents. The chapter, co-authored by Fernando dos Santos, looks at patenting of biofuel technology in Mozambique.
Green technologies
constitutes an opportunity for the least developed country, and especially for Africa, which is endowed with the natural resources, and it can really create a competitive advantage for Africa.
Dos Santos and his co-author from the energy company Petron find that all of the biofuel technology patents in Mozambique are held by foreign entities.
It is important that a local technology mechanism be developed, especially in relation to the small-scale industry in the area of biofuels.
The study by Ikechi Biyoji examines the lack of capacity at African national patent offices. And the final patent chapter, co-authored by Bassem Awad, looks at Egypt's attempts, largely unsuccessful to date, to encourage local development of biofuel technology.
This book contains all kinds of evidence that there is abundant innovation and creativity in diverse contexts throughout the continent.
So the book essentially provides now the evidence that in some cases intellectual property indeed can be an incentive for innovative activity on the African continent, but in other cases can be a stumbling block. And then oftentimes it is not so much a question of either or, but it is a combination of both. A little bit of openness combined with closed systems in some respects. We believe that sui generis models that are just made for a certain kind of innovative and creative activity, more suitable, or at least are worth investigating more.
When we talk about communal forms of protection, like the Creative Commons or the Traditional Knowledge Commons, or patent pools, or communal certification schemes to brand geographic indications, these are all ways in which IP systems are leveraged to facilitate collaboration, not exclusion.
The whole concept of collaboration is a dynamic that we found that is really underemphasized in intellectual property jurisprudence. And this book helps not only to tease out the essence of collaboration in production of knowledge, but also to situate it in critical context in the African societies that we were privileged to really encounter on the field.
Studies which are available in the Innovation and Intellectual Property book, Collaborative Dynamics in Africa. We have very limited copies on the table to your left, and we're fortunate enough to have the authors here if you would like them to sign your copies. So I would like to get some feedbacks, perhaps some questions from the audience, if you have any about the videos or the case studies in the videos.
I had a question about just in general. In the video it talked about how a combination of open and closed systems can be the most helpful for innovation. And I wondered if any of the research pointed towards patterns in that. Because that certainly seems to be the trend of the literature, that you need some closed, some open. But beyond that, it gets very squishy, and I wondered if you had any insights beyond that about what kinds of things should be open, what kinds of things should be closed, and whether maybe there's something particular to Africa. Certain kinds of things should be more open here, even if they are more closed elsewhere.
Does anyone else have a question?
Does the book handle the IPR, intellectual property rights, as a whole, or from one side? It's tackled the copyrights, patent, authority models, all the models of rights, or you focus on some rights like copyrights and patent?
Okay, one more question.
I apologize if I jump into conclusions there, but it seems that the work
is based on traditional forms of intellectual property laws in general, and then trying to adapt them to what appear to be modern day needs. And to my mind, I question the wisdom of that, taking patents, copyrights, and so forth, and then trying to think how can we use them in today's world, where in fact some would argue that some of those legal systems are, excuse me, basically obsolete, such as copyright, for example. And I don't understand the need for the mixture between open and closed dealing with the products of innovation, but perhaps we ought to rethink those bases again rather than try to fit them in those old boxes that don't seem to fit very well.
Okay, so Jeremy's going to address this very quickly, and then in our next scenarios video, I think a lot of the questions that you guys have answered, have asked are going to be answered.
If I can elaborate on behalf of all of the authors of chapters in the book and the book's editors, the other two editors are also in the room, Tobias Schoenvetter and Chris Armstrong. The book aimed to look at intellectual property systems very holistically, not specific kinds of intellectual property rights, but rather the system of knowledge governance as a whole. And this segues into the last question, actually, because we were trying to understand not how, well, this was an open question, actually, whether African countries or industrial sectors are adopting orthodox or Western IP systems and then trying to just squeeze a square peg into a round hole, or trying to create sui generis systems, whether that was the answer. And what we learned, in fact, was that there were sui generis systems, but they weren't even labeled as intellectual property systems per se. And Dick Kawuya's study is a great example, where if you had to label what was happening in the formal-informal sector interactions, you'd probably term it as trade secrets, but even that's not really appropriate because the legal framework and the contractual framework wasn't in place. So it was a much more organic system. To answer Laura's question about patterns, I think it's a fascinating question, because just like the book didn't dictate that certain kinds of intellectual property rights are appropriate in certain circumstances, what the book revealed is that what's happening now on the ground and the answers and policy prescriptions that you might advocate for now are really just a small part of the equation. And that in understanding what the appropriate policy framework is, you need to anticipate the future directions of society, the economy, technology, and industry. And this segues perfectly into the second video and the second part of our open air project. One of our methodological innovations was using the technique of foresight. Foresight research is an empirical method not to forecast the future, not to predict it in the way that a meteorologist might try to predict the future, but rather to imagine multiple plausible scenarios and then to look backwards at how our policy framework fits in that pattern. So if I could, I might actually defer your question until after we've learned a little bit more about the scenarios that we showed.
I'd like to make a quick comment in response to Sherif, who we go back a long way, so I sort of, by means of background, I can just clarify what may seem not very clear. I think what we went in for this research is to look at what's happening on the ground, which is very much the kind, evidence-based research. That's the most important thing. So I think we did not go in with any preconceived notions. In fact, I even put my A2K, tried to put my A2K aside, and I think this may clarify what may seem to be a slight misunderstanding. So we didn't go in to say, let's look at Western IP models and whether what's happening fits in with them. Nor did we say with a preconceived idea that everything open is good, and then let's propagate for this. And my colleagues can correct me on this, but I think we went in with an objective eye of the researcher and sort of put our conceived ideas aside to see what's going on. And I think the conclusions are perhaps one step more nuanced than what we would have expected, you know, that everything open is good, and hence I guess this relates a bit to Laura's question. And every case study has its own characteristics, and the conclusion will be different for everyone. So while we still have our belief in the openness and so on, still what we have found is that it's a little more complex than what we would have been set out to do had we had any preconceived ideas. So I hope this sort of helps answer your question.
Yes, Laura, you were very right. What we found on the field is there is, just exactly like Nagla said, there is no specific case of complete openness or a specific case of completely closed scenario. So what we find is a dynamic interaction between what is closed and what is open. Let's take an example. If a particular region in a country are known for the production of a specific product using a specific method, so the marketing of that product tends to exclude those who do not cultivate their products in that region. So to that extent, there is some degree of closeness around it. And if you flip it to what our colleague Dick did, when you have some tradespeople who trade apprentices as to how to fashion equipment or do some stuff, they begin to form some community of closed knowledge system, but they're not completely closed because they are willing to really open up a little in order for knowledge exchange to happen. So throughout all the chapters of the books, we see dynamic interaction between closed and open scenarios. And that's why we came back to say, for the most part, what we found on the field in Africa is that there is so much the conventional intellectual property system is capable of learning from this knowledge production that happens on ground in the realities of different African societies.
The key term we've used, especially with regards to, you know, IP, as we think about it in the informal sector, is appropriation. So the issue is not so much the traditional tools for managing knowledge in terms of patents and all that, but issues of who appropriates what knowledge, in which ways. So I think you see that, and I think we got that from innovation economics literature, but it has sort of expanded the scope in terms of what we are talking about, or at least what we see in the informal economy. So probably we could look at the scenarios and see what is actually going on, because some of these issues actually play out better in those scenarios.
Scenario building is really about trying to map out a possible path, or future, or direction. An organization, or an individual, or a people, or a continent might take, or any particular issue.
In truth, every single person builds scenarios. Always asks, what if I do this, this might happen. Whilst if I make this decision, the route is more likely to be that. We are actually building scenarios of the future and then coming back to make sure that the decisions we make today give us the future we want.
In our case, the issues were really innovation and intellectual property. Intellectual property has become such a phenomenal concept and is now a discipline that touches every aspect of people's life. In fact, in some cases, intellectual property is a matter of life and death. So we're asking ourselves, what is the future of innovation and intellectual property going to be like in 2035 in Africa?
The Open African Innovation Research and Training Project, known as OpenE, has spent 3 years researching scenarios. The scenarios developed look ahead to the future of knowledge governance, innovation, and intellectual property in Africa. A draft report on the scenarios was launched during a conference at the University of Cape Town, attended by participants from 53 countries. The final scenarios report is now freely available on the OpenAIR website. The publication is the product of extensive research, including in-depth interviews with experts in Africa and around the world, and 10 different scenario building workshops attended by OpenAIR network members. A key task for the OpenAIR scenario builders was to decide which forces are most likely to be the drivers of change, pushing the evolution of knowledge, innovation, and intellectual property in Africa between now and the year 2035. It was only after nearly a full year of research and workshops that the beginnings of distinct scenarios began to emerge.
We had about 5 possible scenarios out of almost 20 and 30. So we continue to think, talk, consult different individuals up to a point where we decided on 3 possible scenarios.
We devised 3 scenarios, which will be presented to you now.
These are 3 overlapping scenarios. And all of these perspectives, none of these perspectives are right, none are wrong, none are certain to occur, none are impossible. And so your perspective matters. The map that we've provided for you in the OpenAIR scenarios will hopefully influence you and your mindset in your future work.
My name is Nagares, and I'm working on the wireless engagement scenario. It's a world where appropriate technologies have taken place. Africans have made very good use of mobile technologies, and we call it wireless engagement. There are tons of opportunities for young people. Because at the end of the day, male-dominated, there are some opportunities for women, but the culture still prevails. It is not a rosy world because there is always a stain in the towel. There are those who are left behind. There are those who do not have access to the phone, to charge their phones. In the case of Egypt, for example, there are young rates of basic reading right literacy, and those will stay in the way of the inclusion that is offered in this scenario. The creation of knowledge and innovation will very much gravitate around formal structures, hierarchical structures, the mix between proprietary and even open licenses and open IP will still work with standards that cater to the global environment. In general, the recommendation of the research will be to keep an eye on the threats. Those who are not able to learn the rules of the game will really fall behind, and is likely to be a widening gap, not just digitally, but also in income and development in general.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this one. You follow the union. So the one that thinks this is the union, and it is. It has been for a long time. Although we have decided to ignore it, we thought it would go away. However, it's not.
The folks in the informal sector don't think about the formal IP systems, IP building, intellectual property. So those aspects of intellectual property which are important to them, like personal reputation, how you do the job, build the brand, those are important in terms of fostering the informal sector. The biggest with the informal of the new normal is some uncertainty. For instance, China comes in, builds the institutions, and the wipe out the small guys on the streets. That, I think, constitutes a risk assumption for this particular scenario. We think that in this scenario, the formal sector and the public sector needs to pay more attention to how innovation happens, whether it's business or technology in the informal sector, and make sure that it's actually supporting those informal innovation systems.
Welcome to Social Africa. We are reviving our traditional knowledge and practices. The elders and the youths are having a concert of progress. and we are taking our destiny in our own hands.
We begin to see, as we get further into the future, the critical realities of environmental crisis, resource scarcity, and with a combination of several factors. So traditional knowledge, sustainable development becomes the very strength that we would have. Systems that are based on customary norms and practices are likely to be revived in terms of having the society be the gatekeepers of their knowledge systems. The risk we could identify in this scenario is that there is a tendency for people to withdraw back to traditional values and never really define what constitutes traditional values in the year 2035. And that becomes a significant opportunity for discrimination against people. So these scenarios will be useful to policymakers, to private sector business leaders, to civil society organizations, to academic researchers. All of those stakeholders can benefit by thinking more open-mindedly about multiple, plausible, but distinct futures.
The purpose of scenarios is threefold. 1, information gathering. 2, bridge building. And thirdly, strategizing, making strategy. And we hope that this is simply stage 1, part 1 of a longer process.
I must say that indeed this has been a very, very fascinating event for me. So I'm sure I've gathered a lot of information indeed. I think the 3 scenarios that we've been through have been very informative. I am now part of a network, I can say that. We are talking about the future is unsure. Whatever happens in the future, we want to be engaged. But we can only do so if we are involved in things that are relevant to our continent, to the countries, to the people at the grassroots level.
We are taking a commitment to seriously continue debating these issues and how to face the future of innovation in our continent. Thank you.
Now, we're going to have another round of interaction with the audience. We would like to hear your feedback or questions about the scenarios, as well as some input from the scenario team on the panel here.
So let me ask the audience a question. We did work on this for a good few months, maybe over 2 years, and we presented three scenarios. One of them is wise engagement, where a vision of Africa that is, as you have seen, that is connected and, and that where there will be inequality. That was my scenario, so I remember it very well. And then there were my colleagues' scenarios of informal is the new normal, and the third one was sincerely Africa. Now, we did not put any value judgments. There is no good or bad scenario. Every scenario has its good sides and its sting in the tail. But just from the presentation, I would love to hear from you. What did you think of any of them? Did you relate to any of them? Did you see, this is what's going to happen to Africa in 20 years? I don't want to put in the spotlight, but I always like to hear the response of, thank you. I don't mean to run.
Personally feel like the informal is the new normal is already what's happening. It's not a scenario, it's what we're experiencing right now. And I'm curious to learn more about this particular scenario and the kinds of recommendations that emerged. Thank you.
And then get responses from the panel.
Few answers. Yeah, please think about it. This will bring questions. We want to hear questions.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Here's a question there.
Thank you. First, I think this is a really amazing piece of work, and personally, I think especially the issue of awareness is of special importance, perhaps because I'm a person that works in technology, But I think that eventually wireless is going to be a truly enabling factor for the entire continent. And even the problems you cited, Nagla, there, I see them technologically being solved in the near future, like, lack of power and so forth with solar chargers and different forms of technologies and so forth. So eventually wireless will create a huge amount of connectivity, even to those we think that are unable to use it. And I think the technology will also help us solve illiteracy problems as well. So there's a lot of innovation in technology in terms of voice recognition and gesture recognition and so forth, that reading and writing in the traditional sense might not be as necessary as it is today. So I think this will create a huge change. Which brings me back to my previous point, which I hope you don't mind if I take you back to it. And actually coming back at it as a question, because I've noticed that from your case studies and your discussions that there are roughly two types of systems that in which we're going to be thinking of open versus closed. There are those which I think naturally promote closeness because they are naturally closed systems, like saying Kenya tea or Egyptian cotton and so forth. So those are systems that are linked to a locale, and by their very nature, they're closed. You can't have Egyptian cotton in North America because it wouldn't be Egyptian. On the other hand, there are systems that would benefit more, or at least seem to be designed to be artificially closed, like trade secrets or trading crafts information and so forth. Personally, I think those are the systems that will eventually go away because of technology. Systems that promote artificial scarcity would die out because technology makes it impossible to contain this artificial scarcity. So if we think that every person in Africa will have a mobile phone that's connected to the internet or something like it, then guarding trade secrets is, or that type of knowledge, I think is not feasible, nor is it actually useful to do. Perhaps the opposite is actually what's useful. Thank you.
Question, and then we can get responses from the panel.
I'm asking from a user standpoint because I work for a startup that's working on innovating sources of education in Egypt. So we've been faced by a lot of challenges in terms of intellectual properties because our main platform is YouTube, where we put our educational videos basically. So this issue has been raised and we didn't have the right knowledge or capacity building in terms of intellectual properties. And I think that the monopoly of the internet traffic on some sites has put a lot of pressure on small startups that are using these platforms because we have to follow the YouTube guidelines and so forth in terms of intellectual property, which is quite very tight, let me put it that way. So I'm not sure if this falls under the scenarios or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I think there was a specific question on the informal sector scenario, what we call informal, the new normal. But before we get to that, can you think of other possible scenarios besides the three that I've described? As we mentioned in the video, there are so many others we looked at, but some of these three probably don't make sense when you think about the Africa you live in or the Africa you know. So are there other possible scenarios that you see besides the three? Informal the new normal, actually we got that term from the World Bank. 2013 World Bank Development Report. And that is significant because for a long time, most of these institutions, and quite frankly, most of the African governments and many governments all over the world, did not acknowledge the informal sector. Those who did, the policy, public policy intervention or response to the informal sector was actually to formalize. You know, if you have the informal sector in certain aspect of the economy, what you do is to formalize that sector in terms of registration and all those sort of mechanisms. But what we've seen is that despite that policy objective, that has not been achieved. And there are a number of reasons why. One of which is that there are specific reasons why the informal sector is resilient, right? And one lens through which to see that is innovation. It is much faster than the formal sector. In terms of the ability of the state or the governments to actually get all these informal sector or informal economy activities or enterprises into formal institutions or entities. Most of the African governments simply don't have the capacity to do that. So you see that this trend has sort of been growing since the early 70s when much of the research started and continues to grow. So you go to any country in Africa and you see that the informal sector is now the predominant source of employment, the predominant sort of source of economic activities. So the idea that it will somehow go away, whether through deliberate public policy or government action, is simply not true. So that is sort of the basis for looking at a possible scenario where the informal sector is basically the new normal, and some people would argue that it is actually the norm right now. So basically that's sort of the general thinking behind this scenario. Now, in terms of specific dynamics for the informal sector and IP, or at least intellectual property, or more appropriately, knowledge governance or knowledge management, we see in this scenario, and the case study which I contributed in the other book, that most of these issues are inappropriate, or most of the folks who operate in these spaces simply don't think about IP the way we do. However, that is not true for all informal sector activities or practitioners or entities. There are those who operate close to formal sector institutions. And quite frankly, many informal sector entities go back and forth between formal and informal. So it's not sort of a linear process or a dual existence for most of these institutions. So to the extent that there's that space where informal sectors interact or even transform into formal institutions, there are aspects of where IP sort of emerges somehow. The example that was mentioned of the electric vehicle is quite illustrative of this, where you have formal institution, university, college of engineering, designing this car and outsourcing the actual fabrication of some of the parts for the car to the informal artisans. Simply because the university, with all the resources and the intellectual capital, simply doesn't have the know-how of actually translating the design into the actual car or parts of the car. However, they do understand that this design, if simply passed on to the informal sector artisans, and those guys go on to distribute or share those designs, they could actually lose out on certain IPs associated with that model. So what do? They get those artisans to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. So we are giving you this information for the sole purpose of designing the parts we are commissioning you to do. Okay? So that is the extent we see IP, formal IP. But to these guys in the informal sector, they are proud to be able to tell everyone that cares to listen that, you know, these guys at the university, the American University in Cairo, they have all the PhDs, but they can't actually translate this into actual products. So I think that's sort of one way to think about this sort of relationship between informal and formal, and the role of IP in that sector.
To the gentleman who spoke about technology, I'm also as interested in wireless engagement as in every other young African on the continent now. Obviously, because of the exciting prospects that it brings forth in terms of, information about markets, about democracy, etc. Then when you begin to think about wireless engagement and innovation, it's, at the beginning even more exciting, because you would think that you solve the problem of wired technology and the last mile by going wireless. But then you find that when you begin to consider the IP for wireless innovation, the IP regime in itself is the last mile problem, because you find that innovation may happen in a local space, but that the infrastructure to be able to commodify that innovation happening is either lacking in African scenarios, the expertise is lacking, and even then that when you begin to think seriously about what kind of innovation is being brought forth, in a sense, as she said with YouTube, you have a sort of tragedy of the commons, because a lot of the technology in wireless engagement is patent technology, and there is a lot of stonewalling around patent thickets, so that young fellows are trying to innovate, but they find that all the core planks of innovation are held up under somebody else's patents. So in African spaces, there is a sense that people try to work collaboratively around technology and wireless engagement innovation. But that's difficult to scale when you begin to think about where do you go for funding, because venture capital needs a portfolio of patents and or some access to the market or demonstrable success in the market. So when you think about the closed system, and and you would think that this system would not be as closed, but I think it continues to have the same challenges as we had with wired technology.
I wanted to relate the scenarios to the question that somebody posed earlier, and link it to the book project that we showcased. And you said that systems that promote artificial scarcity will most likely die, or it's not sustainable. And that is very important. And we went to the field looking not necessarily at intellectual property. The framework of our analysis is actually knowledge governance, and the broader framework, how knowledge is governed and how knowledge is produced and how knowledge is put to use. And so when you say systems that will promote artificial scarcity will likely die, and that appears to be what we found. And we also recognize that the knowledge production that happens in cultural contexts. And so our field work enabled us to go into the field to interact with the real and critical agents of knowledge production and the cultural context in which they operated. And we began to realize that there is always the layering of open and closed scenario. And we cannot have 100% closed scenario for knowledge production or 100% closed open scenario for knowledge production. And so this is really one of the things knowledge production in African context has to teach the rest of the world. And why that is important is because the failure of systems that emphasize absolute closeness is that they are the least socially beneficial for the dissemination of knowledge. And that is why, if you relate it to informal, the new normal, you still see that we train apprentices, not based on how much money they can pay, but as a result of loyalty. Somebody might be a well-trained auto mechanic, and he decides the gifts he can give to the community is to take his nephew and put him into that trade without even asking for anything. And the social benefit of that investment is one that cannot be captured by intellectual property. And this is the kind of issues we took away from the project.
Yeah, I'll just take a minute. I think I acknowledge very well the tensions between the small players and the horizontal platforms as opposed to the vertical hierarchies, and that was actually at the heart of the discussions that we had when we were thinking of the scenario. I think the way when we look forward in 20 years and what we sort of envisioned after a long set of discussions, much as we would like for the technologies to solve the problems and so on, maybe in reality there will always be an unprivileged group. I mean, no matter how much I agree with you that in many ways information communication technologies and with all the developments, it can be an equalizing driver. But at the same time, maybe it's not that easy, because there will always be advancement, and there will always those who are doing better actually at the very because of the utilization of technology. That's the nature, actually, of information technology, and at the heart of this is formal intellectual property systems, in a way that you will always find a startup like Hebas stuck with you, by the rules of a large player. But we even went further than that, because perhaps people like you are eventually going to get the support that they need to stand. I mean, you're functioning, you're standing on your feet, you will be doing better and better, but there are always those who will not be as privileged for one reason or another. They may not have the access, they may not have the education, they may not have the contacts, so there will always be, on the one hand, some solutions, yes, offered by the technology, but there will always be an inequalizing factor. I mean, just the very mere growth, the very simple statistics of income distribution, even in the US in the late 90s, there was a severe inequality when there was the tech boom. So yes, ICTs can be used as an equalizing factor, can be used as for development, the whole ICT 4D, but at the same time the argument can be flipped. And at the heart of this is actually intellectual property and the closure of intellectual property that will make the large hierarchies even more established. And I guess just one last thing, in a way we were trying as much as possible to, as I said, not be going sort of a positive scenario and a negative scenario. Every scenario has its positive sides, but also has its sting in the tail. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment about the scenarios and about your comment that the informal sector is already a very plausible scenario on the ground. The thing is, in all three scenarios, there exists cases of such scenarios on the ground, and it's actually scenarios that are meant to be plausible options of how the future might unfold. So we have to go from here and then look forward at possible drivers of change and patterns that are going to move us forward in the future. So it has to come from something that's plausible and that already exists. It's not thinking for the future. It has to come from here, and we have to go forward for the future.
If I can, I'd like to come back to the question about patterns, because that's, in a way, the ultimate point of the scenarios as a research and a thinking exercise. It's a heuristic, a tool, different lenses that you can look at the future through and try to discern different patterns. When you think about what kind of intellectual property rights are relevant, it's not an either-or question. It's contingent. It depends upon which scenario you're talking about. And if you're talking about a future of wireless engagement, then the question is whether the African context, the Silicon Savannah, is going to look like the Silicon Valley and the intellectual property systems that currently apply there in the future. And there'll be power struggles between open and closed systems. When you think of informal, the new normal, the knowledge governance structures are much different. You're talking about improvisational, resilient, ad hoc, and dynamic systems of knowledge exchange. And when you're talking about Sincerely Africa, you're talking about cultural, spiritually significant forms of knowledge governance. And so the message for a policymaker is, when you think about your policymaking priorities and where you want to invest your resources, you've got to think about how your decisions today will unfold in each of those futures. When you ask the question of whether the system is open or closed in one scenario or another, that's actually incorrect. The real question is, who is the system open or closed to? So in wireless engagement, and you've got a system of Creative Commons or open source software or patent pooling, The system is open if you have the legal and the technological and the economic capability to participate. But that system is very much closed to you if you lack that capacity, the resources, the education, the skills. An informal or a spiritual or an ethnic connection to a community. You may actually be geographically dispersed throughout the diaspora, but yet that knowledge is still open to you. But if you're a community outsider, that knowledge is then closed. So the real question is not whether there's a pattern of openness or closedness in respect of a particular technology, or there may be an additional question, but the key question is who is knowledge open or closed to in these scenarios? And that's, I think, the important pattern to observe.
Thank you, Jeremy. Do you have any more questions from the floor? Yeah. I think this can... Oh. Bruce.
So my apologies if I missed it, but my understanding of scenarios is they evolve when you decide on a key variable and then decide on some of the potential expressions of that. What were the key variables or drivers that led you to select these three?
So I can speak to that methodologically. We spent a year and a half in workshops, almost 2 years actually. We held 10 workshops involving dozens of experts, and we did a series of interviews, hundreds of interviews actually, to distill those key drivers of change. And we identified 5 drivers of change, and these are enormously complex and large-scale drivers of change. So one of the issues was statehood and governance, and the patterns of how African countries define themselves and their governance systems. Another one of the key drivers of change was identities and differences, cultural identities, religious identities, ethnic identities. Employment was a key factor, employment and demographics issues that will unfold. Now, some of those are quite predictable. You can actually forecast and extrapolate what the world might look like. And then finally, infrastructure and technology. Infrastructure and technology, including not just ICTs, but physical infrastructure, roads and rail, those kinds of factors. And finally, wildcards and shocks. And the thing about building the scenarios using this method, which is quite well established, is it's not like econometric modeling where there's a single variable you control for everything else and change a variable. It's much more nuanced and complex. And you mentioned we had 20 different scenarios on the go at one point when you map how these might converge or diverge. And we distilled these into just 3. There might be others.
In that case, just a tag on to that. What strikes me is not only are these 3 plausible futures, but one can imagine different aspects of these scenarios manifesting themselves in different countries, different sectors of the economy. So thinking forward, you've got this now. If it was your team or someone else or reactions to it, how might the different patterns of where these potential futures show up look like, and what that might tell us about the changing nature of poverty, exclusion, development moving forward?
I'll speak to that a little and see if any of my colleagues could complement what I have to say. Africa is about 54 countries. And from, let's say, from Cape Verde to South Africa, from Sierra Leone to Nigeria, Liberia, or even Uganda, you will find that there are different critical states of development and different political dynamics and knowledge production processes across cultures. And therefore, when you look at the scenarios, what you find is that while on the face of it, without going into details, wireless engagements might appear to be relatively attractive to the dynamics unfolding in Nairobi today, it might be a remote call somewhere else in Africa. But even within those places where it is a remote call, it might be a plausible scenario in a particular urban concentration in that very country. And so what we find is that we have to navigate the complexities of Africa, and through the book and the scenario building, we recognize that scenarios can be activated or engaged to a certain degree by way of plausibility in percentage or dynamic across time and space, and even following up on wildcard situation that can even activate some of these scenarios in ways that are most unpredictable.
Say that is that these scenarios are not mutually exclusive. So they are going to exist in different societies in different ways at probably different points in time. But if you look at some of the African economies, for instance, Mali is one of those countries with very high levels of informal sector or informal economies or informal activities. So it is plausible to assume that informal is probably going to be more evident in that society or that country, and other societies, South Africa, for instance, being an advanced or advancing economy, the other scenario will probably play out more there. And I think that's sort of very important when you think about these in terms of policy, because policymakers and quite frankly to some extent politicians, they like to think of simple, straightforward ways of dealing with social issues. So we don't want them to think about these scenarios as, okay, this is where we are probably going to go, and this is what we are recommending under this scenario, and this is probably the kind of public policy directions we need to pursue. We want to emphasize that these are complex processes that are not linear in nature. So I think that sort of complexity needs to be acknowledged.
Also to add, I mean, for instance, in Nairobi, you find that there is an interplay between wireless engagement, Sincerely Africa, in the same scenario, and to give a good example is that the transport sector in the country is completely informal because government long since divested from public transport. So that what we have is private public transport. And of course, the big challenge for that is that it's completely off the grid in terms of taxation, that you have a huge informal sector that moves the country around, but the government can't account for it in terms of taxation purposes. And then now you have this wireless engagement coming into that informal sector and attempting to create technology that formalizes that informal sector. So look, we understand and we are completely unable as government to provide public transport. Well, at least we'll pretend that we can, but in the meantime, we want to take wireless technology and begin to account for the money that's moving in this informal sector to see if we could tax it. So then you see an interlapping of those scenarios in one single sector.
Thank you.
Through cashless pay, right? So, sorry.
I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit more, Douglas, don't worry. So, Douglas is also an open air fellow. He's based at the eastern hub of the project, which is SIPIT in Nairobi. So, basically what I would like to hear from you is a little bit about how the open air research in your fellowship has impacted your life and your research in Nairobi. Like, what impact did the open air have on you?
So the scenarios were interesting because I was encountering this type of research for the first time. And so when I went back to Nairobi, like I said, I work a lot with hubs of innovation which have taken off on the continent over the last 3 to 5 years. So where, everybody says that Nairobi is famous for coining tautologies like Silicon Savannah. And so in the university where I work, we've got a big center that's funded by a lot of donors. And typically, you have a lot of eager innovation happening from technologists and social entrepreneurs trying to use wireless engagement. And it's now my decided view that this is one of the areas where Africa can catch up in solving its own problems, using wireless technology. So I came to this as an IP lawyer. Without too much multidisciplinary thinking about the problems that the law faces when it tries to social engineer. And then I found that, for instance, number one, we don't have the infrastructure for an IP system, right? We've got laws that are essentially modern, but we don't have the human manpower to, for instance, draft patents. It's the first problem. So the technology, in that sense, as it does everywhere, has moved ahead of the law. But even if we could change the law, you have this problem that we're not sure, say, for instance, in wireless innovation, that we want to follow, a Western-led model of proprietization. So I haven't found that it is a good thing for the technology space in Kenya. And so I'm constantly found by developers who come to my offices, to the research offices, and tell me they want a patent on something. And 3/4 of the time I'm telling them, no, you don't want a patent. And the question usually revolves on how big do you want to scale? If you only want to work in Kenya, then maybe you want to invest a lot more thinking in your brand and pushing your brand out there. If you're thinking of going Africa and beyond, then I begin to make the arguments of, now then let's play the IP system, because then you want to stop other people from taking this product and replicating it in several jurisdictions. So it's clear to me that once I encountered the scenarios that the dichotomies of intellectual property regimes don't fit neatly in African innovation scenarios, and that you have to give very particularized advice. I give very particularized advice to the young innovators who come.
Thank you, Douglas. I thank my panelists and I thank the speakers for your attention. And both books are freely available for download on the Open Air website, which you will find a link to on our conference website. I now hand the floor over to Nagla for some logistics.
Thank you. Logistics again. We're going to have what I will ask you to make a 10-minute break. We're coming up to our last session, which will be about research policy, research advocacy and policy. I know we're getting to the end of the day, but I promise I will have some energy to, liven the discussion. It will be an interactive panel of questions to panelists, and hopefully the audience will be engaged as well. So we will not be giving presentations. It's more of Q&A with the panelists and with the audience. So kindly try to be here in 10 minutes. Then we'll have a session. Thank you very much. Okay, I know it's a challenge, the last session is always a challenge, but it gives me pleasure to be the moderator of the last session, and I will also have a hat of a presenter, although I'll be very limited in my comments and allow to give my colleagues more space. The title of this session is Research, Advocacy and Policy, and as I mentioned in the morning, in the opening session, this is sort of inspired it was initiated by the team members, but also inspired by the New York Times article about the impact of research and the value of what professors do. So at this point, I would like to present the panelists. On my left is Tobias Schonberger, from IP Law Unit at the University of Cape Town. It's also on the coordinator of the Open Air project. And next to him is Prakash, Yale Information Society Project Fellow, but also at the Center for Internet and Society in India. And we also, to his left, is Hiba Ghannaim from the Tahrir Academy, which is an alternative online platform for, it's an online platform for alternative learning. And we were supposed to be joined by Jazim Hilawi, who you saw on video this morning, but it was going to be difficult to bring him in an interactive panel. So Jaz is with Open, he has Open Radar, but he's also very active in Open Government Tunisia. So unfortunately, Jaz cannot be with us, but I just asked the team to sort of show you the link to the Open Government Tunisia. I see they're doing wonderful work, so I think it is definitely worth your time to check out their website. And so if we could go back to the Open Government Tunisia, if we could go back to the panel title, and the way this is going to go is as follows. I will ask the speakers to take 5 minutes to tell you what they do in the area of research, advocacy and/or advocacy to impact policy change. And just for 5 minutes, each presenter. And then I will then have a set of questions that I will ask the panelists, and I also encourage you to think of your own answers to those questions so that we will have an ample half an hour for Q&A, and I certainly want this to be an interactive panel with input from the audience. So I hope you had your coffee and tea, and that we will have 1 hour energized and active session. And thank you very much for sticking around. So without further ado, Toby.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't have the, I have a cold, so sorry for that. I hope the voice is going to make it for the session. I didn't have the graveyard shift last time, so that's a first. Let's see how we're going to get through the session. But I can promise you one thing: I just went outside, and you really don't want to be outside. You want to run inside at the moment, right? I think it must be more than 40 degrees, so pretty unpleasant. So thanks for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. And the thoughts that I have on the topic of research, advocacy, and policy are mainly informed through my work of being involved in research projects. You heard about the Open Air project a little bit earlier in the last session, and I've been involved in that project now for the better part of the last, I would say, almost 6, 7, 8 years. And I'm involved in many other research projects, and as the director of intellectual property, which you was mentioned a couple of times today already, I'm also involved in research projects on the periphery of things. So even if I'm not directly involved, there's always colleagues that work with Nagla and others on many of these interesting projects that you have heard about. So I'm only given 5 minutes, so I rather delve into that as quickly as possible. And I think the key problem that we are facing these days is that, and that most of us can probably subscribe to, is that while there's indeed a lot of knowledge being generated in academia, too little of that really makes it out of that kind of academic bubble that some of us, including myself at times, I suppose, live in it. And it certainly does not always reach the policymaker space. So you asked yourself, with every new project that you're doing, how can I change that? What is the reason for that, right? The reason for them is simple. All of the reasons are not simple. And then I show you what I think was from the project that I've done, and what people have told me in feedback to the work that we have been doing, what some of the reasons could be. So some of the academic work, I think, just doesn't pass the reality check, right? So it's like research for the sake of research and has not really the kind of practical relevance that is necessary to inform policy. And then some of the research, while it is more practically oriented, it is not policy impact oriented. So a policy maker would not pick up on research that is, yet it's not only research, it's practical, but it's not really policy impact focused. So I think this is also some research output that probably doesn't necessarily lead to policy impact. So these two kinds of research works are easily kind of disregarded in terms of finding the policy impact that may or not be starting. But there's two other reasons for that. The one is, I think, pretty obvious to us, and that is the wrong packaging of academic
academic research results. What we tend to do is we use very complicated language. We use the kind of legalese that we are accustomed to when we talk to ourselves, but the moment you talk to others, you kind of lose them in the process. And policymakers are not necessarily coming from the same area that you are coming from. We talked about open access, we talked about subscription-based journals, and then many of us still lock up our research behind paywalls, subscription-based journals, right? So yes, again, those well-heeled universities are very well able to pay for these subscriptions, but the moment you are outside these universities, and other universities, or even outside the university circle, again, nobody actually really does have access to that. So policymakers may be included in that group. And then this kind of TLDR phenomenon, right? The dialogue when I get emails, right? Too long, didn't we? So we try to get more and more kind of pieces, it's kind of this knee-jerk reaction to some of these things. It's like, oh God, no, I'm not going to read that. So I do believe that many of these packaging problems can very easily be fixed on our side. It can be fixed because it's our fault, right? We can think about that. We can kind of come up with solutions to these problems. But there's another problem that I think is very often overlooked in this context, and that is that our academic output is increasingly. And by the way, everything I'm saying is open for discussion, so I'm very much looking forward to your views on that. So later I will tell you kind of controversial is one of the strategies, so I'm trying to also be a little bit controversial here for the sake of keeping the discussion alive. But the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that I believe that academic output and policymaker realities are increasingly incompatible. But the problem is on the demand side. So I'm blaming policymakers here a little bit for a second, but I think we also need to be aware that not everything is our problem. So what do I mean by that? How much time do I have, by the way? 2 minutes? 2 minutes?
3 minutes.
Okay, great. So what I do mean when I say that research output, some of the research output that we are producing and what policymakers really want is incompatible is this. When you read many of our research outputs, what you find in there as like the kind of overarching suggestion is like you challenge existing models severely and you call for long-term solutions. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But many policymakers that I've dealt with, at least in the past, and this is mainly in South Africa, so maybe that's a South African problem, but I don't think it is. Many of the policymakers that I deal with have almost like fallen prey to what is called in the private sector the phenomenon of urgency addiction, right? So they have not enough time to spend on each issue. The problems that they actually want to be solved are too narrowly defined. At least they are more narrowly defined than the kind of research question that we set ourselves. They need an instant fix oftentimes. They try to avoid risk. And honestly, the general status quo is hardly ever questioned. So fixing instead of solving is what people are looking for. And the gentleman that made that comment earlier in the previous session who said, and he's not here, I think, at least I can't see him now, but maybe you can convey the message to him. So he said, he questions whether it's wise, what OpenAIRE does, that we actually do not question the bigger concept of intellectual property protection, whether we should not do away with copyright protection in the first place, right? No, at least any of our work will be very inclined to do them, and at some point, right? It's not very practical to suggest that, I think at this point in time. You also need to find a solution for a current situation. So, that's what we try to do with OpenAIRE, right? We wanted to say, okay, this is the reality. Let's find ways to make the reality work best for us, while perhaps at the same time still questioning with other projects the general concept as such. So it's not a mutually exclusive kind of thing. So very quickly, what can we do to actually increase policy impact then, as those people who create research that is geared towards policy impact? First thing, there is no blueprint for that, right? So if anybody tells you there is like I guess a recipe for making that happen, that promise you success, then it's probably too good to be true. But and that's the main reason for that is that processes are just not linear enough to actually have these kind of solutions available accessible to them. But in terms of better packaging, we can do open access publishing. We can try to fix that in 1 minute here, and we can try to have human readable versions of what we create. So I always use I'm pretty involved in the Creative Commons movement, so we use the terminology of human readable as opposed to lawyer readable. So this is what I meant earlier, that we actually package this in a way that people outside our profession really do understand that. Short and to the point summaries for the media, for example. Policy and business briefs is something that has proven successful in the past. Do workshop and use websites and social media platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn groups, and so forth. But in terms of creating a useful product, the problem that we are actually not responsible for, because it's the urgent addiction on policymakers that we still do something that hopefully will policy impact. First, at the beginning of the project, consider developing a policy influence strategy. What are the processes? What are the activities? What actions are intended to influence policy throughout your project? Describe the changes that you like to see and the methods and tools that you want to use. Identify and involve engaged policymakers and so-called champions from the outset. Involve them. Invite them continuously throughout the project, and include qualitative research in methods in your research, because quantitative analysis in Africa, at least, is not something that on its own seems to work very well. And the foresight scenario, you heard that earlier. I watched it from the back, this presentation, but when we talk about foresight, everybody is kind of lightening up. This is exciting. This is interesting stuff. So if you have the time and the money to do that, then include this. And during the research itself, engage policymakers, mass communication measures, don't preach to the choir. This is an important one. I have been to so many conferences where everybody was like, but doesn't mean anything if there's nobody from the areas, from the stakeholders that you actually really want to influence, right? So if I talk always to A2K people, I know that they agree with me, right? But it makes no sense whatsoever. I went to a conference last November in South Africa, and that was one of the most terrible conferences that I've ever been to, but I found it most rewarding because it was people that came really from the other side of the aisle, right? And it was for the first time that they were kind of hearing about these A2K issues, and they came to me afterwards, and this was a bit of a light bulb moment there. So this is extremely useful. And then last thing, sorry, Nagla, consider partnering with advocacy groups also. So we as researchers are not necessarily the best people to do advocacy work, right? We're not specialists in this area, so perhaps some on all sides. And advocacy groups, they really know what they are doing in this field. And lastly, try and anticipate and grab policy influence opportunities. This is why we do the kind of projects that we're doing in South Africa. We know the law needs to change in South Africa in the area of intellectual property. We know that it's going to happen in the next 10 years. That's why we do the kind of research that we're doing at the moment, to have the kind of research evidence readily available the moment the lawmaker wants to do that. And this is actually what you wanted me to talk about. The IP policy in South Africa, the draft IP policy that was published last year. We were ready. We were up in arms, I would say, almost, right? We had all the information there to really contribute to this IP policy discussions. And when people started to question some of our submissions points, we actually said, no, this came out of a research project that we did. Here is how we did it.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned IP policy. I think your presentation is very important. It frames our discussion, and I will want to hear more about your work within the IP policy or otherwise through answering the set of questions that follow. Thank you very much. Okay, Pradesh, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nagla. I think I'm going to spend my 5 minutes trying to talk a little bit about my organization and the kind of work that we do, and then leave many of my recommendations and ideas to the latter part, if that's fine. So what does the Center for Internet and Society in India do? We do both academic research and policy research. We have a kind of differentiation between the two. Both of them, importantly, are focused on both both of them have theories of change, but of different sorts. Okay, so it's not as though the academic research is just navel-gazing. No, it isn't. But they're focused at different audiences, and this might come out a bit odd, given that our name is Center for Internet and Society, but not all of our research is focused solely on issues pertaining to the Internet, because many of the areas we're working on and where we hope to have policy impact, they aren't Internet-only issues, and as I go on to explain what they are, I think that'll become clearer. So the different areas that we work on, we distinguish them into different programs. One is accessibility for persons with disabilities, and we're trying to enhance that now to access for marginalized people. And in this, we've focused on at every level of the policy value chain, as it were, right from getting policies passed in government, looking at laws and trying to get good amendments passed in terms of laws, doing research in terms of what the problems are currently, having trainings with regard to, say, web developers so that they understand how to make accessible websites, then following up on those trainings to actually see how many government websites are actually accessible, and doing that kind of, empirical research, not just legal research, etc. And having done some of this, we realized that the scope for doing something we normally don't do. We normally don't do software-related work, etc. But in areas of accessibility, we actually are doing software work, and we've hired developers to do work around getting eSpeak, which is a very important engine, text-to-speech engine, to be able to use that with Indian languages, and we are fixing dozens of bugs with NVDA, the most popular open source screen reader there is for visually impaired persons. The next program, and I'll run through these really fast, is Access to Knowledge, in which we look at IP reform. So looking at institutions like WIPO and at all the different kinds of treaties that are being negotiated there. At national law, we were one of the main groups giving input to the copyright law amendments in India. At court cases, we are right now fighting a court case around intermediary liability in India. Looking at IP alternatives, things like Creative Commons, open government data, we've done a report on that. Open standards, we've had some policy victories on that. Free and open source software, open access to scholarly literature, some victories on that too. Open access to law, we've done a report on that. Open educational resources, etc. So all the opennesses are covered, and we also have a large project relating to Wikipedia under our Access to Knowledge program. Then we also look at internet governance, at issues like freedom of speech and expression. This gets us the most amount of publicity as it happens amongst all our work, and it's not necessarily the largest component of our work though. We do work around privacy. We've done a fair amount of work around the unique identity database in India. I think we've done the largest amount of work around privacy of any organizations in India right now, and we've had a large project going on in this for the past almost, I think, 3.5 years now. And around surveillance, legal reform, we were part of a government-appointed panel of a group of experts proposing privacy principles for law in India, and we've also written out the law so that when the government actually comes out with the law, we can compare it. We do some work around cybersecurity. We're just trying to ramp up on that. And now with the new grant, we're doing more work around internet governance mechanisms and institutions, looking at things like multi-stakeholder models, at particular processes that are going on, such as the IANA transition at ICANN, etc. And we also work on telecom infrastructure, at spectrum reform, on issues like network neutrality, etc. I realize I've gone over my time, so some of the recommendations about what I find has worked in case of CIS, as well as answers to the questions you've posed, I'll leave to later.
Thank you very much, Pramesh. Yeah, I was going to suggest that I'm sure a lot will come from both of you and from Hiba as well in the next round. But please, let's listen to Hiba from the Tahrir Academy. Hiba Ghanyan, thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me. Thank you, Nagla, and thank you, Nadine, as well. I'm here representing the Tahrir Academy. It's an online space offering new learning experiences, or what we call mind-stimulating learning experiences. What we do is, our dream is to have a different Egyptian generations coming up of critical thinkers and knowledge seekers. So we're doing it through two things. We're doing a blended learning model, which is based on critical thinking and other components, but our main component now is educational videos of our own built curriculum, like I said, based on critical thinking. And doing that, we use two things. First of all is the community, the Egyptian community. We rely purely on the Egyptian community in terms of educators, creators for our videos, learners and everything. And the other component for us, or the main power for us, is the internet. So we are an open source initiative. We provide educational experiences free on YouTube in terms of videos. And our dream and hope is for these videos to reach every Egyptian student from 13 to 18, which is the age bracket we're working for. And basically, this is what we do as research. We research around the world. We know we have, I don't know how to say it, but the kind of counterproductive curriculums, traditional curriculums in Egyptian schools. So what we're trying to do is we're doing research around the world on the best practices to teaching different subjects to 13 to 18 years old. So this is the type of research we're doing, where we see around the world what's the best practices to teach physics, for example. We adopt an inquisitive approach. We give them the questions to the answers they've been memorizing in schools for years. So a kid would be memorizing, theory of whatever, or genetics in biology, for example, but I would come and tell him, why do I look like dad or mom, and so on. So this is our dream, is to reach Egyptian learners and to reach them with this type of curriculums. So we want to influence the Egyptian government or the Ministry of Education specifically in terms of curriculum building to change their own philosophy of how they build their curriculum taught in school, And for us, there's better way to reach the students at this age in terms of mass reach rather than school. So that's why we try as much as we can to advocate and talk to the government. However, we face a lot of challenges given that we are considered the kind of alternative curriculum or education to the current system. So this is basically in terms of research that we do. And advocacy as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiba. The questions, I have a set of questions to the panelists, and I really encourage you to think of your own answers to this. So I will ask, we'll change the order, but I will start by Toby, and then we'll change the order after that. My first question is pertaining to research. It's a very simple question. Is research necessary to achieve policy impact? And is it sufficient? Is it necessary? Is it sufficient? Research, the research that we do we need this to achieve policy impact? Thank you.
Thanks. It's always difficult to answer a question that you say it's an easy question, right? So let's try to come with simple questions. Yeah, I think the answer is relatively simple, and that I do think that, of course, there is opportunity for research to really contribute to policy impact. And there is, otherwise we wouldn't do what we are doing, right? If we wouldn't believe that there is a case to be made, that we can actually achieve a change in policy impact with the research that we are doing. At the same time, I believe we must also recognize that there's other factors, obviously, that do lead to policy change, right? And in fact, I seem to remember that I did read in preparation for this session that I did read an article or something that actually evidence-based research results and findings do not play a major role in policy impact and change. So we need to be aware of this, and then we need to try to find ways of changing that. And I think this is, now I can talk slower because I talked faster earlier, but captured all these things already. Now I can always come back to these things. And I think the translators will probably like that a lot. So I think when we work on these things like packaging and understanding that we may actually produce also at times the wrong product, then we can actually get to a point where what we do present and find and create as our research findings will then eventually impact policy.
Thank you. Pranesh, is it necessary and is it sufficient research for policy impact?
For both of those, I think my answer would be no. Is it desirable? Yes. It is greatly desirable. And I can give you examples from stuff we've done in CIS. The reason it's so desirable is because it lends you credibility. Okay, it makes you more than just an advocacy organization, right? And that allows people to quote stuff you've done and use it while asking for change themselves. So I'll give you one example, and an example that didn't result in policy change, but I think has changed the landscape so much that it could possibly in the future do that. In India, the government introduced a new law around intermediary liability. That is liability of things like your web host or your blog platform or Facebook or your search engine, etc. Now, the way the law was structured, there was no reporting mechanism or transparency mechanism. When you sent in a complaint to an intermediary, they had to respond to you. They had that duty, and they had the duty to remove the material if it fell within a certain category of in certain set of categories. But they did not have to tell the government, they did not have to publicize it on their website, they did not even have to tell the person whose content it is that's been complained about. So this is a perfect black box, in a sense, while doing policy research, right? You don't really know, how do you measure the impact of a law when there's no way of finding out how many people are actually using the law, when you have no way of finding out how these organizations are actually implementing the law, and so there is no actual empirical evidence. You could perhaps fall back on interviews, but you might not get good results from that. So what we did instead, we sent fake, frivolous, fraudulent complaints, okay, under this mechanism to different kinds of intermediaries, always making sure that there were some errors in what we did, so that and they were requests that should not have been honored by the intermediaries. They should have, returned it, said this doesn't meet the requirements of the law. Yet, what we found was that in 6 out of 7 cases, the information that we requested to be removed was removed. And this research, and we meticulously documented this it was done by a Google policy fellow who was working out of CIS at that point of time, and we meticulously, provided a good report about this process. Not only did we do that, we came up with an alternative proposal, okay, saying how a takedown and a notice and takedown mechanism within the current kind of law, something that could be similar to the law that the government had proposed, but with the necessary safeguards to keep it in line with the Constitution of India and in line with freedom of speech. So we proposed an alternative written in legalese, with nice diagrams and flowcharts, etc. We did all of this. It didn't work. Okay, it went all the way to Parliament. Parliamentarians used our research and in fact quoted from it as well. Okay, and so that was great. But eventually the regulations, the government said they would change it, they would hold consultations. They didn't, and there's a new government now. They're also, I'm hoping they'll change the laws, but I'm always hoping for these kinds of things. But it didn't work. But I think that gives you credibility, that allows news organizations to use this evidence to say it's actually not working well, and creating that kind of research has a great amount of value.
Thank you very much, Hiba. And perhaps you could also talk about advocacy, but let's first talk about research. Is research necessary?
Yeah, I think it's very obvious in our case in terms of education, because what we want to do is for the government to adopt a new curriculum building process. And for us, everyone is talking about the educational problem in Egypt, but no one has done any research or or proposing any actually alternative scenario. So if I can go to the minister or the Minister of Education and said, please change your curriculum, they would, add a grade or take a grade out or spread the subjects over more years, and this is not what we want to do. So I come and tell them very specifically, based on my research, developed countries are doing that. They're not jumping to conclusions when they're proposing information. They're doing logical build-up, or they give customized learning experience for kids at this age, or you know what, you can teach them economics via football. Here's what our creatives are doing. So I'm giving him examples, and I'm doing proper research to make him feel that this is actually attainable, because I don't think they have the capacity of talent inside the ministry or the government to actually do that type of research. And the case I was just telling you about, we had a video explaining why Pluto is not a planet anymore. And for your information, in the 4th grade science book, it's still a planet. So we had a bit of a problem, because there's a 10-year-old girl who saw our video and then went to her science teacher and said, okay, Pluto is not a planet anymore, but the book is saying it is a planet, so what's the deal with that? So, and we had a call from the school, and it was at first, but because we had done our research, I talked to the school and said, you know what, in the 11th grade book, it's not a planet anymore. So because we're doing our research on their curriculums and what's happening around the world, we're being able much more to influence the policy making.
Thank you very much. So let's talk about advocacy for a minute. I mean, we talk about research, we do research. I know Toby mentioned advocacy in his presentation, but maybe you can start with him and go the other way around. I mean, is advocacy necessary then to bring about policy change? Is it sufficient? Is it enough to advocate? Where does it fit into this big picture?
I think advocacy is very important, but it's not the only factor needed, because you have to have the political will actually to change. Because if I come and tell them I need you to change the curriculums because I want Egyptians to think critically and solve problems in a much deeper way, I'm not sure if he wants that actually. So there's the political will. Okay. The political will is something very, actually it's the main criteria for us, but advocacy is very important, but it needs to have like a win-win or coming down to talk. If I'm telling them, can you please take my videos or my open source knowledge or my knowledge that I'm providing and go put it in schools, he would tell me, okay, but you need to abide by my curriculums. So there's no actual middle ground to talk about. So advocacy is important, but if there's a will, then there's a middle ground actually to advocate.
Thank you. Pramesh, you mentioned the example where you send the fake letters, and that to me sounds like it's starting from an advocacy standpoint. So is this, I mean, where does advocacy fit with, I mean, clearly you guys are busy with that. Is advocacy necessary? Is it sufficient to impact policy?
I'll answer the second question first and then come back to this. So is it necessary, is it sufficient, and does it need to be informed by research? It is necessary, it isn't sufficient, and I believe it should be informed by research. Sometimes tugging policymakers, heartstrings results in policy change without any, not even a shred of evidence backing that up. I can cite numerous examples from India, where, for instance, in '91, the fact that one of our foremost poets, Rabindranath Tagore's works were about to come into the public domain, led to an amendment to the copyright law extending the term of copyright. There was only one parliamentarian. If you go through the transcript of the debate, you'll notice only one parliamentarian who doesn't just extol the virtues and the greatness of Tagore and his value to Indian society, and who actually looks at the link to copyright, who asks, actually, hold on, increasing the term of copyright will mean that we'll have fewer editions of Tagore, and how is that going to benefit, Tagore's legacy? So sometimes those kinds of research and evidence just doesn't matter. You just need to tug at the heartstrings, and that sometimes works. Okay, but I think to have an effective campaign, especially when you're in a position like ours, even for those emotive arguments, such as the work we did around getting an exception for persons, for visually impaired persons in copyright law at an international level, there was a great deal of research that had to, back that up. Along with just the advocacy necessary for it. And I'll also mention one other thing, which is that I believe in any kind of policy change, an ecosystem approach is necessary. You have to be broad-based. Different organizations will have different focus areas. Ours, for instance, isn't around advocacy. We might get there someday, but for the present times, we're much more research-oriented. Different organizations also sometimes adopt different stands, right? Some who are radical, who won't, whose proposals probably won't be able to become policy, but who actually are great at creating awareness. Okay, you need those kinds of organizations as well. Then you have those who make deals with the devil, who sit inside, the kinds of environmentalists who sit with all those corporate polluters and try and hash out deals. You need those kinds of people as well. And I think that kind of an approach where you have different kinds of organizations having different stands and having different expertise areas really helps. And if you're in a position to help create that kind of an ecosystem, then you really should. And of course, you have to do all of this without compromising your core principles. But yeah.
Thank you. Toby, advocacy?
So I fully agree with and underscore what my friends and colleagues here on the panel have said so far. But I think the one element that I would like to add to the discussion is that we probably, to answer this question, need to also look at the different kinds of advocacy that do exist, right? So there's different forms of advocacy, and I think while research Well, I like to believe that there is forms of advocacy that actually do not necessarily require research to inform that advocacy. I think there are certain elements, and certainly the ones that I'm usually working in, that do require proper research to be conducted first, or at least you need to find out whether such research already exists, right? So I would call what we do legislative advocacy in a way. And if you're engaged in these kind of things, you better back that up with facts, because if you don't do that, people will catch you out, right? They will notice that you actually can't back up your claims to the extent that it's necessary. So I would think in these cases either find the evidence that already exists, research evidence, or if it doesn't exist, then create that evidence yourself. Again, and this underscores something that Pranesh was saying now at the end, and I want to emphasize that really, is focus on the strength of the institutional network that you're working with. So if your strength is not advocacy, then I suggest, at least for the time being, until it becomes a strength for you, then partner. Consider partnering with those institutions, individuals, or networks that actually do know what advocacy entails and how best to conduct that. We, in fact, are in the process of trying exactly that at the moment. We, at the Intellectual Property Unit at the University of Cape Town, we want to do some more research on the intersection of intellectual property on the one hand and human rights on the other. So, but we want to do that, we want to actually create an academic network to actually, a scholar network to investigate these things, but we are fully aware that this is we're only walking half the way. But what we actually want to do is to see to what extent we can actually provide the meat for the discussions in the field to those advocacy organizations in the field to take that further from there. We're not claiming that we want to, or we're not aiming to do that, but we are actually the provider of the necessary material.
Thank you, Toby. I think I'll move on to my last question because I just want to highlight that we keep talking about policy impact, but we perhaps want to remember what is this policy for. We're looking for change, and change is the ultimate objective. And actually it is one of our keywords in this workshop. So in our understanding of research, advocacy, policy impact for change, I'm going to ask my panelists the last question, which is what is the one big challenge that you face in your work within this context, in your research to bring about change in its wider sense? So, Toby, do you want to take that? We'll just go the other way, yeah.
The one top challenge is probably that there is a thin line between advocacy on the one hand, at least, again, it's open for discussion, right? But there's a thin line between advocacy on the one hand and activism on the other hand, and I have a reputation to lose as a scholar in a certain field if I perhaps get too involved, and I'm making that trying to be as cautious as possible, because I do see the value of activism as well, but at least from most of the projects that I'm involved, I'm trying to maintain this kind of almost somewhat neutral, leaning towards the one side, but still neutral kind of academic in a field that provides the evidence, and to some extent gets involved in advocacy, but does not really want to be involved in activism. So first of all, this is a thin line. This is a challenge to not fall over on either side of that. And I think, the other one is just a reiteration of what I did say earlier, that evidence-based arguments, I suppose, are still not valued highly enough. This is something that we create this evidence, right? So we need to also make sure that people do value that more highly, so that we create also demand for our own work. Thank you.
Thank you. Pranesh?
So Tobias kind of said what I wanted to, which is that evidence-based policy making, while I think is extraordinarily important, it's not necessarily the predominant form of policy making right now, and changing that takes a lot of effort, and so that's a challenge, that's a constant challenge, and alongside that, trying to get funding, especially domestic funding, to say that evidence-based policy making and trying to create research around that is an important function is quite difficult. And in India, there aren't that very many precedents for that. I'm hopeful that slowly things are changing and will change at a more rapid rate, but that's something that makes a difference and makes your job much harder if you have to keep scrounging for funds, especially domestic funding, which leads me to my last point, which is about goodwill. maintaining goodwill within with policymakers, with your other stakeholders, with the community. That is I think, always a challenge. Transparency helps a great deal here. We put out, all kinds of information about our organization from the amount of funding we receive from each and every organization, to where all we spend that, to what all our individual salaries are, to, we try and be as transparent as possible, because, and in addition to, being good community members in terms of allowing people to use our space, being good partners of that sort, etc., etc., because that really helps carry you forward, and so that's perhaps not a challenge, but that's something I'd strongly recommend. As a, yeah.
Age of 18 to 18 years old in mass reaches without going into schools with the government hand in hand, or position yourself as a tool for the teacher in school. So for me, if the policy making was handled the way it should be, our job would have been much easier, given we're an NGO, we're a limited team, we cannot do mass reach or invest in advertising to reach these students. So definitely.
Thank you very much. If I may just take a couple of minutes to contribute to the discussion before opening it to the group. I have an experience of working, and I mentioned this morning, so I will not repeat it, but this center we have undertaken research on open source software, and then we worked very closely with advocacy groups, and I remember fondly the late Ali Shas and the Arab Digital Expression Foundation, who hand in hand worked with us in bringing this to eventually a reality of a strategy that the Ministry of Communication Information Technology asked us to write. Us as Access to Knowledge for Development Center, my colleague Nahid Azab Bezira invited her to the team, and we actually drafted a strategy. Now, if I may answer to the last question, because the challenge, and I want to share with you the challenge that I had as an academic, asked to write what was supposed to be a strategy. Actually, there are two challenges. One of them is working with the civil society. The bar is very high. The bar of advocacy groups is very high. And on the other hand, you work with the ministry, the mainstream thinking is there, and so basically I would find myself on the same day sort of having my own discussions at the ministry, trying to raise the bar as much as possible, and then going back to meet the civil society and sort of step between the two groups. On the one hand, one group wants to raise the bar, and on the other hand, the other group is really trying to sort of push it down, and I'm squeezed in the middle. That was a real challenge, and perhaps it speaks to what Toby said earlier. As academics, our heart is in advocacy, but we have to do our work objectively, and at the same time we have to sort of deal with pressures and perhaps with with interests that make our job difficult in achieving the policy impact. So the objective is this one and the same, but I think we may come to it from slightly different angles. So this is one challenge that I face, and I wanted to share with the group, and maybe that also gives some fruit for discussion. It just not on the side, I think, and that's pertaining probably to other developing countries and in Egypt as well. Even when we undertook our research on open source, we had a lot of difficulty finding data, the dearth of data on the subject, and perhaps some of the data may exist, but it's not readily available for a number of reasons. So I think this is a challenge for the researcher in our part of the world in general, but it also puts sort of an additional challenge if this research is meant for policy change. So you really want to present a well-researched solution, evidence-based. So what we usually resort to, rather than finding the numbers that do not exist, but we resort to interviews and field research and other methodologies that are also rigorous and that can bring that can inform policy makers in a sort of a rigorous and professional academic research. So with that, I thank my speakers, and I open the floor for discussions, and I really encourage you to ask your question or provide your answer actually to these issues. Where do you stand from this issue as a researcher, as an advocate, as a policy maker, perhaps as a student? So I would really love to hear from people in the group. Thank you. So do we have
section of advocacy and research, and that's the question of research ethics. From a research ethics point of view, and I'm not talking just about psychology research or clinical, pharmaceutical trial research, it's seen as unethical to design a research project with the explicit objective of changing the behavior of your research subject. And so, particularly for those of us who are based at universities, it's difficult to explain how you're going to do policy-relevant research with the express objective of changing and influencing policy, and yet get ethics clearance for that. So perhaps there's some insights from people who might not be subject to the same university framework about how they deal with ethical issues around research. Pranesh, for example.
Thank you for the question. Takers? That's a difficult question. It's a very good one. Yeah.
I have to go back to UCT's ethics clearance form to answer that question, actually, to be honest. But I wouldn't subscribe. I wouldn't subscribe to that. I think that, again, that's a thin line that we were talking on in another field, right? If your whole project is just geared towards just changing the behavior, I think then it's probably unethical. But if it's a natural kind of result of what you're doing, then if that is evidence based, right? If you actually provide the evidence for that research subject to change its position, then I personally don't see anything ethical about that. I've filled in quite a few ethical documents. I don't think I've seen that in UCT's one. So maybe it's a global south, global north thing.
Very honestly, it's not a problem that we have really thought about or encountered, because usually the subjects of our research don't tend to be the people we're trying to provide input to. It tends to be laws. It tends to be other kinds of things. So those are the things we're actually studying, and then in turn we pass it on to policymakers or to an advocacy organization, etc. And so because that tends to be different, it generally we haven't had to face this problem. And in the few situations where we've undertaken in a sense participant research, by actually, and this instance that I cited, right, where we ourselves sent, takedown requests to see how, whether the intermediaries complied with it. Even that, I don't think gives rise to particular ethical issues, because we don't really. They're not the people we are trying to change directly. We're trying to change the law. But I can give you an example of something I have thought about as a possible research topic, but whose ethical implications I'm very uncomfortable with. So in order to study the impact of the new cyber cafe regulations, where all the history logs of people using cyber cafes in India have to be kept for a minimum period of a year, and they have to be linked to the person's real identity. Now, in order to see whether that results in any kind of chilling effect, one thing to do would be to yourself go to cyber cafes and to go to the various browsers and open up their history tabs and actually do that kind of research. But does that, given that you don't know whose browser histories those are, does that give rise to privacy implications and ethical questions? I don't really know, but it is slightly on the gray side in terms of ethics.
Naveed, please.
Yeah, so actually there's something interesting about your question. If you
if you run the survey experiment or a field...
Raise your voice, please, sorry.
So if you run a field experiment or a survey experiment in a way to run a study for having a policy recommendation, if you change the behavior of your subjects, then actually there are problems with the internal validity of your study, right? Because you're basically building the pool, or there's something actually problematic with the study per se. So I would say that in a study in which you're changing the behavior, it's not there's no internal validity to it. So even before getting to the ethical question, the policy implications would be problematic. Right? Does it make sense?
I guess the paradox is that for some, not all, policy-relevant research, the policymakers whose behavior you're trying to influence are part of your body of research subjects. They're either your interviewees. It's not necessarily like a large-scale survey, but oftentimes you're gathering qualitative data from them directly. So it's a complex issue, I think.
Can we have the one-on-one maybe afterwards? I think it would be nice to sort of also bring in others in the discussion. So I would love to hear. I know it's late in the day, but I really would like to get different feedbacks on the discussion, just from different perspectives. So. Sorry. No takers. Well, did you want to comment, or was there also comment? Did you want to? No, you need the mic, please.
So this is actually an amazing question in a way, because there's a normative component to policy recommendations. So you basically, well, you can have the showing of objectivity. That's one thing. But we're saying that the perfect objectivity doesn't really exist, because as I'm doing this research, normatively I'm changing the mindset and the worldview of the people that I'm trying to convince with my objective aesthetic. So, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I think we can carry. I think one of the things, if I may just make a comment, I think as a researcher, you go with a hypothesis and you look for evidence, and you can actually accept or reject your hypothesis. And I think that's how we were taught, as researchers in my field of economics. You get the data and you test the hypothesis. And actually, quite often, what happens in our research is that we sort of find evidence that make us reconsider what we're trying to find. And sometimes the intriguing questions are actually the ones that evolve as you do your research. And I think, we go through that in our work, in our current research actually, quite often, and these are the challenging projects, is as the realities change and as the results that keep coming, make you go back and sort of rethink your hypothesis and rethink your question without impacting the result, without influencing the result, but sort of improving the research question, contextualizing it in a way that while keeping your objectivity, it makes your work actually more nuanced, without influencing the impact. Tony?
I think the interesting part about that, and the longer I think about that, the more interesting I find that question, right? The problem is that, and I think you said it to some extent, Jeremy, already, is that this problem only really arises if you're doing a research of a certain kind that we actually perhaps believe is better than the typical kind of research. What I'm trying to say is the problem only arises then when you actually involve your stakeholders from the outset. Now, in the legal field, this is not the typical legal research. The desk research, the normal research methodology is desk research, right? And then you would normally not get into these kind of problems. But we make the point continuously that you only see half the picture. You actually need to compare the law in the books with what is really happening on the ground, what the practice is, right? But you can only know about the practices when you actually start to talk to the stakeholders. And if then what you say is true with the ethical clearance in some countries, or as a general kind of concept, then this is a real problem. I find it fascinating. We should definitely have a follow-up session on that at some point.
Yeah, I think on this note, I want to thank my panelists and the audience and Jeremy for his wonderful question. I think it's important to raise more questions than answers. professors. I say this to my students in my, it's always leaving us thinking about questions is actually, in my opinion, the best outcome of such deliberation. I thank you all for being here, for sticking around, the speakers, the guests, the team, our supporters, our friends, our beneficiaries, I should say. It's been a long day, but I think it's been productive, lots of food for thought. I thank you all very much and wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.